I used to think that being quiet was the same as being invisible. For a long time, I let myself believe that. It was easier that way. My name doesn't matter much to this story. What matters is that I spent 31 years married to a man who never once asked me who I was before I met him. 31 years. I raised 2 daughters, kept his household running without a single missed bill, and stood beside him at every company dinner, every charity function, every golf tournament where the wives were expected to smile and hold their drinks and not say anything too interesting. I did all of it. I did it well, and somewhere along the way, I made the mistake of thinking that was enough. My husband was in international trade, industrial equipment, specifically the kind of heavy machinery that gets shipped to manufacturing plants overseas. He had built his company from a regional distributor into something genuinely impressive over 30 years, and I want to be fair. He worked hard. I watched him do it. But somewhere between the first million and the 5th, the man I had married began to disappear, and the man who replaced him was someone I recognized but did not know. He started traveling to Germany in the early years, Stuttgart mostly, and sometimes Hamburg. His biggest client was a manufacturing group there, and over time, those relationships became the spine of his entire business. He learned German. Not fluently, he would be the first to tell you that. Usually with a laugh that was meant to seem humble but never quite landed that way, but enough to get through a meeting, enough to make toasts, enough to make the clients feel respected. He was proud of that. He mentioned it often. What he never mentioned, because he never thought to ask, was that I had lived in Munich for 3 years before I ever met him. I was 24 when I took a position with an American accounting firm that had just opened a European office. I didn't plan to stay long. I stayed 3 years. Long enough to become fluent, long enough to dream in German some nights, long enough to understand not just the language but the way people moved through it, the precision of it, the particular weight of words that have no English equivalent. When I came home changed in ways I couldn't quite explain to people who hadn't been there. I met my husband 6 months after I returned. He was charming and ambitious and certain of himself in a way I found magnetic at 27. He knew I had lived abroad. He knew I had worked in Europe. He never asked much more than that. I remember mentioning Munich once, early on, and he said, "Oh, you'll love Stuttgart then," and moved the conversation forward without waiting for my response. That was the first small erasure. There were thousands more. By the time I turned 62, I had been living in a particular kind of loneliness for longer than I could precisely measure. My daughters were grown and gone, one in Seattle, one in Austin, and the house felt enormous in the evenings. My husband was home 3 or 4 nights a week, and on the nights he was there, he was present only technically. He sat at the table. He watched his programs. He answered his phone in the other room and never told me who had called. I noticed things. The way you notice weather changing before anyone admits it's changing. Credit card statements that arrived at his office now instead of the house. A second cell phone I glimpsed once in his coat pocket and never saw again. The name of a woman, Claudine, that appeared on his screen when his phone rang one Sunday morning, and he answered it in the garage with the door closed. I didn't confront him. I want to explain why, because I think people assume that staying quiet means you don't see. It doesn't. I stayed quiet because I had learned, over 3 decades, that confronting my husband without evidence only ever produced 2 things: a denial so smooth it made me feel unstable, and a coldness that lasted for weeks and made the house feel like a waiting room. I needed to understand the full shape of what was happening before I made a single move, so I waited. I watched. I kept my German entirely to myself. The dinner was scheduled for a Thursday in October. My husband told me about it 2 weeks in advance, which was unusual. He rarely gave me that kind of notice for anything. "A new partnership," he said. "A German industrial group looking to expand into the American market. Their principal investor was flying over specifically to meet him, along with 2 members of the group's executive team. He wanted me there." "Why?" I asked, not unkindly. "Because you're good at these things," he said. "You make people comfortable. Just be yourself." He meant, look appropriate, don't embarrass me, don't say anything that takes attention away from the business conversation. I wore a navy dress I'd had for 2 years. I did my hair. I looked, I thought, exactly like what I was supposed to look like, the composed, pleasant wife of a successful man, present but not intrusive. The restaurant was a private room at a steakhouse downtown, the kind with dark wood paneling and waitstaff who refill your water without being asked. My husband was already there when I arrived, and the Germans arrived 10 minutes later, 3 of them. The principal investor was a man named Dieter Hartmann. Quiet, late 60s, silver-haired, with the particular stillness of someone who had been in a great many rooms and found most of them unimpressive. Beside him was a younger man introduced as his financial director, and a woman named Ilse who, I gathered, was their legal counsel. They greeted me warmly. Dieter shook my hand and looked at me with a directness that I found immediately restoring. He asked where I was from, whether I had traveled much. I said Ohio originally, a little time in Europe when I was younger. He nodded and did not press further. The dinner began in English. My husband was at his best in these settings, animated, attentive, asking the right questions about the German market, referencing things he'd read about the group's recent acquisitions. I could see Dieter watching him with careful approval. The wine was good. The conversation moved along. Then, about 40 minutes in, my husband leaned toward Dieter and said something in German. It was a joke, I think, about Americans and their portion sizes. Dieter smiled. The financial director laughed. My husband, encouraged, said something else. And just like that, the table bifurcated. There was the English conversation pleasantries mostly, that included me, and then there was the German conversation, which did not. I understood every word. My husband's German was imperfect but serviceable. He made small errors that a native speaker would never make, but his meaning was always clear. For the first 20 minutes, the German conversation was entirely professional. Supply chains, tax structures, a distribution arrangement that would allow the German group to use my husband's existing network as a launching point into the Midwest market. I sat with my hands in my lap. I nodded occasionally at things said in English. I watched Ilse refill her wine glass. I thought about nothing in particular. Then Dieter said something that shifted the entire register of the conversation. He said, in German, that he always liked to know the character of a man before entering into a serious agreement with him. He said this pleasantly, almost philosophically, the way someone might observe that the weather had been unusual this season. He was not challenging my husband. He was simply, I understood, opening a door. My husband walked through it. He said, and I want to be precise here, because precision matters, that he was a man who kept his private life and his business life separate, and that this was a skill most Americans lacked. He said it with some pride. Dieter asked what he meant. My husband said that a man who could manage competing obligations without letting them interfere with each other was a man who understood how the world actually worked. Dieter waited. My husband continued. He told Dieter that he had certain arrangements in his personal life that his wife did not know about. He used a word, Beziehungen, that can mean relationships, arrangements, connections. He did not elaborate on what kind, but his tone made the meaning sufficiently clear. He said that he had also, over several years, been careful to protect certain assets from what he described as the complications of domestic life property held through a business structure in another name, accounts maintained separately. He said it the way a man says something he has said many times before, to audiences who found it impressive. He said it the way a man says something he believes the room will respect. I did not move. I had a sip of water. I set the glass down exactly where it had been. Dieter's expression did not change. Ilse looked at her plate. The financial director had gone very still. My husband, reading silence as approval, added one more thing. He said that a wife who had been out of the workforce for 30 years had very little leverage in any disagreement, that the law was one thing, but reality was another, and reality tended to favor the person who had controlled the information. He smiled at Dieter after he said it. Dieter did not smile back. There was a pause, not long, 3 or 4 seconds, in which the quality of the table changed entirely. The English conversation, such as it had been, had dissolved. My husband picked up his fork, satisfied, and cut into his steak. I looked at Dieter. He was looking at me, not in the way people look at someone they have just noticed, in the way people look at someone they have been watching for some time. I held his gaze for a moment, then I set down my own fork, folded my hands on the table, and said, in German, that I hoped the schnitzel in Stuttgart was still better than anything you could find in an American steakhouse, Because my husband had been raving about it for 30 years, and I had always been curious whether the reputation was deserved. The table went absolutely silent. Ilse looked up. The financial director blinked. Dieter and I will remember this for the rest of my life, let out a short breath that was almost, but not quite, a laugh. My husband's fork was suspended in the air. He stared at me. The color moved out of his face in a slow, visible tide, the way color leaves something when the heat is pulled away. I continued, still in German, addressing Dieter. I apologized if my accent had softened. I had not had as many opportunities to use the language as I would have liked, living where we did. I said that Munich had given me a great deal, and that I still thought of the city with enormous affection. I mentioned the firm I had worked for. I mentioned my neighborhood. I spoke for perhaps 90 seconds. Dieter responded as though we were resuming a conversation we had always been having. He asked which part of Munich. He commented on the firm I named. He knew it, had done business with them years ago. He asked whether I had kept up my reading in German. I said yes. He nodded. My husband put his fork down. He said my name. I turned and looked at him with an expression I had been composing for approximately 40 minutes. I didn't know you spoke German, he said. His voice was very careful. You never asked, I said. I said it in English. I said it clearly, without anger, without any tremor. I had decided somewhere during the state course that I would not give him the satisfaction of seeing me lose my composure. Not there, not in front of Dieter Hartmann. What happened next at the table was businesslike, and for my husband, very cold. Dieter excused himself briefly. A phone call, he said, and when he returned, he directed most of his remaining conversation to Ilse and the financial director. My husband attempted twice to re-engage him on the partnership terms. Dieter responded politely and said they would be in touch. They were not in touch, not with my husband. On the drive home, my husband said nothing for the first 10 minutes. Then he said that I had humiliated him. I looked out the window at the highway and thought about how many times I had driven this road in 30 years. How many times I had sat in this exact seat in this exact silence and told myself it would get better, or at least easier. You humiliated yourself, I said. I just happened to understand it. He said I had made him look foolish in front of people he needed. I said that I hadn't made him say anything. He was quiet for a long time after that. The following week I called a lawyer, not a family friend, not someone from the firm we had used for estate planning, a different lawyer entirely, someone recommended by a woman I trusted, someone who specialized in exactly the kind of cases where one party had spent 30 years controlling the financial information and assumed the other party had no idea what was true. I knew more than he thought I knew. I had been paying attention for a very long time. The business structure he had described to Dieter, the property held through another name, was something I had suspected for at least 4 years. I had never been able to confirm it, but I knew the name of the man he called when he didn't want me to hear. I knew the rough shape of it. I had kept a file in my email, sent to an address my husband did not know existed, with dates and amounts and observations, for just under 2 years. My lawyer was very good. She was also, I think, quietly pleased to work with a client who came to the table prepared. Dieter Hartmann reached out to me 11 days after the dinner. Not to my husband. To me, directly. He had gotten my email address through Ilse, who had found it through the accounting firm I had worked for in Munich, which, it turned out, was a firm Dieter had known for 20 years and whose senior partner he called on occasion. Ilse had done her research the night after the dinner. His message was brief and written in impeccable German. He said that he had done considerable business in America and had learned to value people who were precise about what they knew and honest about what they were. He said that if I was ever interested in consulting on German partnerships, cultural mediation, documentation review, the particular translation work that required fluency not just in language but in context, he would be glad to speak further. I read his message 3 times. Then I wrote back, also in German, and said that I would be available for a call the following Thursday. The divorce took 14 months. My husband retained 3 lawyers. Mine retained 1, plus a forensic accountant who found the property trust within 6 weeks of being engaged. The structure was creative. I'll give him that. A series of LLCs layered through a name I didn't recognize, holding 4 commercial properties in 2 states. The accounts were harder to trace, but not impossible. He told his lawyers that I had always been aware of the company structure. He told his friends that I had turned vindictive in my old age. He told one of my daughters, in a conversation she later repeated to me word for word, that I had ambushed him at a business dinner and destroyed a significant partnership out of spite. My daughter, who had been listening to him dismiss me at dinner tables her entire childhood, told him that she was sorry to hear that. I am not a vindictive person. I want to be clear about that, because I have thought about it carefully, and I don't think that word applies to what I did. I did not set out to destroy anything. I set out to understand my life fully, accurately, without the version of it that someone else had been narrating on my behalf. What I understand now, which I did not understand at 27, is that knowledge held quietly is not the same as knowledge withheld. I spoke German every day inside my own mind for 31 years. I read German novels. I watched German films without subtitles. I kept my fluency the way you keep a skill you love for its own sake, because it was mine, because no one could take it from me if they didn't know it existed. He never asked. I never offered. And one October Thursday, at a table in a steakhouse with dark wood paneling, those two facts intersected in a way that changed everything. I live in a different house now. Smaller, which I prefer. It has a good kitchen and a study where I can close the door. And in the mornings I drink my coffee slowly and read, sometimes in English and sometimes not. My daughters visit more often than they used to. I think it is easier to visit a house where the air is simply air. The consulting work with Dieter's group began modestly: a few document reviews, some correspondence that required precision a translator without business context couldn't provide. It grew. I am careful not to overstate it. I am not building a second career at 63, but I am useful in a way that has nothing to do with what I look like in a navy dress at a dinner table, and that particular usefulness earned quietly over 3 decades turns out to be worth something. I think often about what Dieter said when we spoke on the phone that first Thursday. He said that in his experience, the people who tended to underestimate others were, almost without exception, people whose primary talent was self-presentation. He said it matter-of-factly: the way you say something that has simply been proven to you enough times that it has stopped being an observation and become a fact. He was right. And the thing about people whose primary talent is self-presentation is that they tend, eventually, to present themselves to exactly the wrong audience. My husband did that. In German. At dinner. In front of a man who had spent 50 years learning to read people, and a woman who had spent 31 years learning to wait. If you are reading this, and you are in a marriage where you have been made to feel that your knowledge and your history and your particular self have no value, I want to say something to you directly. Not the version of you that the marriage has been narrating. The version of you that you were before. The version that knew things, learned things, became things, before someone decided those things were inconvenient. That version of you is still there. Precisely where you left her. And she has been paying attention the whole time.